Okay, so I don't know how many of you have already read the intro to the book, but I kind of wanted to start there because I like the way she lays this out. I'm just going to read you part of this. She says, the Old Testament reveals that God created humans to dwell with him. I'll repeat that. God created humans to dwell with him. But something happened to separate people from God. Through the ages, God revealed his plan to reunite people with himself so that they could again dwell with him. The New Testament reveals that Jesus, quote, was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times. That amazes me. This author says she loves looking at the Old Testament from the vantage point of how God revealed his eternal plan. His great love, care, and patience are on display, along with his compassions for those who suffer, his righteous anger with those who mistreat others, and his mercy toward those who seek forgiveness. So, as we go through this study, as we see God's plan unveil, we'll also discover lessons we can apply to our lives, because the Old Testament abounds in examples of how to walk with God. After all, these are the very scriptures that Jesus and the New Testament writers were taught. Many of God's revelations about Jesus occur in prophetic books. You think of books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, the book of Daniel. There's the whole little 12 minor prophets that conclude the last part of the Old Testament. And then the New Testament explains how Jesus fulfilled numerous prophecies in his first coming. It teaches us that he'll also fulfill the rest in his second coming. So what she says, the authors say, they will concentrate on the former. We want to look back at those things predicted about Jesus, and then we'll touch on the future things, the things that are yet to happen. And I like this little sentence she puts in here, that conservative Christian scholars differ in their interpretations of passages about his second coming. So she says, we'll not take a position on those, although Calvary Chapel Fellowship has a firm position. But I love what she says here. After all, the main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. So that's what we'll focus on. But the important thing is Jesus is coming back to take us to our eternal dwelling place with the Lord our God. So, as I mentioned, every chapter has 5 lessons. So, and as you move through the study, you'll see day 1, day 2, day 3, and so forth. So tonight I'm going to kind of highlight, not the whole thing, but just snippets from each one of those days. But I really appreciated what she shared in the beginning, and this perhaps may be the experience you may have had, I'm not sure. She talked about when a boyfriend gave her a Bible and she began to read the Bible. She wasn't a believer at the time. But she writes in the second paragraph there on page 11, as I read through Genesis, I thought, so that's what happened. God created people good, and that was plan A. But they blew it and disobeyed, so God had to go with plan B, a flood. Later, I read about God calling Israel to be a nation and giving them commandments. But the Israelites blew it and disobeyed God too. And I thought, gosh, Israel was plan C and Jesus was plan D. God had to keep starting over because people kept messing up his plan. Not so. So these next couple of paragraphs is what I want to hone in to start with. She says, I had missed the significance of 1 Peter 1:20, which says, Jesus was foreknown or chosen before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times. Revelation 13:8 reads similarly, Jesus is the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And then 2 Timothy 1:8-10 says that God saved us and called us because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ before the ages began, and which now has been manifested through the appearing of our Savior, Christ Jesus. In other words, God knew before he created the world and the first humans that Jesus would one day die for the sins of the world. He knew Satan would deceive Adam and Eve, and he had a plan in place already to rescue humankind. There was always just one plan. And in this study, this book will show how he revealed that plan over time, beginning at the beginning in Eve's lifetime. So in the email I sent you, I mentioned Obviously, there's a lot of prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament, but this study is only going to highlight certain ones from key passages. So we're going to start right at the beginning where it calls it the reveal in Eve's day. So I want us to look back at the beginning. Just open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. I'm only going to read a few verses here. I like where she notes, in the beginning, God. Those are the first 4 words of the Bible, and they introduce the story of how God created the heavens and the earth. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, which tells us there was a beginning of time, from the time that God put planet Earth out there in space and set it in motion, time began. Because God lives outside of time. So for us, there was a beginning. This world had a beginning. And God was the creator. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was empty. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God, so now we're introduced to this second person of the Godhead. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and morning the first day. And that sets in motion the 6 days of creation, where God proceeds to go throughout creating the world and everything in it in order to place mankind there, human beings that he would create in his own image. So fast forward now, look over at verse 26, because this is the conclusion of day 6. So on day 1, God created the heavens and the earth and light. On day 2, he created a sky or an atmosphere. On the 3rd day, he created the seas, and then the dry land appeared, and then all the plants. So you can see how God was forming the earth and then filling the earth and providing everything to sustain life. And then on day 4, in that sky, he put the sun, moon, and stars. In the seas, on day 5, he put marine life of all kinds, aquatic animals. You can easily, and then in the air, the birds of the air, so you can say fish and fowl. And then on day 6, all the land animals, all creatures of every kind. And at the conclusion of, after creating the animals, I don't know if it wasn't at the end of the day yet, but God created man. So verse 26 says, then God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the livestock, over all the earth and over all the creatures that move along the ground. And that is the most revealing verse right there, because it tells us right from the start, you know, we read in verse 1 that there was God, and then the Spirit, verse 2, the Spirit of God. But now we know that there's at least 2, but we find out from John 1 and from Colossians 1 that Jesus was very active and present in creation. So what I want to do is take a few minutes. When I first taught on Genesis 1 through 11, I forget how many years ago it was now, I happened to stumble across a great message. As I was just studying, I came across a great message by John MacArthur. And I love the way he takes those few verses that she mentions and just expands on this whole idea that God absolutely had a plan before time began. Like she said, this wasn't like, oh, a backup plan. Well, I messed it up. Now I got to go with plan B and C and D. No. God's plan of redemption started before he created the world and anything in it. So let me just share with you some excerpts from this from John MacArthur, because he begins here in this verse, and he says, at this point in creation, God becomes very personal, and he begins to speak in relational terms. Let us make man in our image. And so God, for the first time in the Bible, introduces himself, listen to this carefully, in relationship. Up to this point, it seems as though it's just God, but now he defines himself with plural pronouns, us, our. And we're introduced to this fact that God has within his very nature relationships. And that can only occur when there's more than one. So now all of a sudden we're introduced to this great reality that there is this executive divine committee, if you will, a divine council in the heavenlies that are making an important decision. So we are now introduced to a relationship, and this is very important because God uses language that reveals he is communicating with others. He's in communion with others in this creation. So again, where he says, let us make man in our image, that implicates the whole of the Trinity in the creative act. What you have here then is this council of the Trinity engaged in the purpose of creating man, and now is the right time. God had a divine purpose before the world began, and that divine purpose was to take a bride, as it were, for his son Jesus, that God the Father desired to give his son as an expression of love, a bride that would be a redeemed humanity to be given to his son, to love and adore and praise and glorify his son forever and ever, and also to serve him. That eternal purpose of God unfolded within this Trinity, you might say, this executive council within the Trinity. So she mentions here the first verse she mentioned in her intro was 1 Peter 1:20. And there, where Peter is speaking about us being redeemed by the precious blood of Jesus, and speaking of Christ, Peter says, he, meaning Christ, was foreknown or chosen, which means predetermined, but here's the clincher, before the foundation of the world. He was chosen before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times for your sake. So, before Genesis 1, before day one of creation, before this creative week even unfolded, redemption was already planned. So what's interesting to me is that though these things are implied in the Old Testament, it's the New Testament that gives us that revelation, that fact that this was a plan of God before he even set the world in motion. It all began in the beginning. And this is reiterated 2, 3, 4 times in the New Testament. I don't know if she put this one there, but if you're on page 11 of your study guide, I'm going to give you a couple of extra scriptures to jot next to that paragraph, because all of these talk about the plan God had before the world began. So in Titus chapter 1, again, Paul writing to Titus, God had planned redemption before he created the race of people from whom he would draw the redeemed. His purpose, his redemptive purpose, came first. So again, Paul, speaking of the gospel, being an apostle and a bondservant of Jesus to carry this gospel, this message of salvation, this hope that we have. In verse 2, he says, this salvation, this hope that we have in eternal life, which God, who cannot lie, who never lies, promised when? Before the ages began, or some translations say before the beginning of time. So he's talking about the gospel. God's whole saving purpose was something that God, who cannot lie, promised. And in the Greek, it actually says before time began. When did it begin? Before day one, God had already planned the gospel. This is fascinating to me that this was already planned, already prepared before God ever said, let there be. This was the plan he had in mind. So the question is, to whom did he promise it? Well, humans weren't even created yet. He just said, let us make man, so he hadn't done that yet. So the promise wasn't to mankind. It couldn't have been promised to angels, okay? I believe in verse 1, when God created the heavens, that included the heavenly hosts and the angelic beings. And Hebrews 1 clearly tells us that angels are all ministering spirits sent to minister to those who will inherit salvation. You know, so God didn't die, Jesus didn't die for angels, he died for human beings. So who is this promise to? So this gets answered in 2 Timothy chapter 1. So that's the reference she has there. It says this grace was given us in Christ before the beginning of time. And what's interesting is that is the exact same, and even though it may be translated different in English, it's the exact same words in the Greek, before the beginning of time. In other words, from all eternity, God made a promise. He had a purpose that involved Christ Jesus from before time began. So before time began, God made a promise that he was going to redeem some creatures and he would make, and he was going to redeem them by means of Jesus Christ. God made this promise before time began to his son, Jesus. Isn't that amazing? This was a promise to Jesus. I'm going to create a whole people to be in relationship just for you, all before time began. Then we can read in Ephesians, this is another one you can jot down, Ephesians 1, verse 3. I'm showing you where it says all this. How do we know this to be true? Because Paul was very clear in several letters that he wrote about this. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3, where Paul is talking about the purposes of God. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ. Why? Just as he chose us in him, in Christ, before the foundation of the world. So the whole divine decree unfolded before time began, before anything was ever created. Then in John 17, if you want to jot that one down, Jesus is praying in the garden before he's arrested. And he said, Father, it's as if he said, Father, I'm going to create and redeem some people, and I'm going to give them to the Father said. It's as if the Father said, I'm going to create and redeem some people, and I'm going to give them to the Son as a love gift. Because this is what Jesus prayed in John 17. I pray, Father, that all you have given me, will be brought to glory to see our glory. And Jesus refers to believers then as though those whom the Father had given him. The Father then desires to show his love to the Son. It is his supreme love. It is the love that only God knows, the love that is so great that it longs to give, and God determines that the way to express that love is to create and redeem humans and bring them to glory. Because that's just what Jesus prayed. I want you to make us one and give them the glory you gave me because you loved me before the creation of the world. Jesus, God the Father, the Holy Spirit, they were already in relationship before they created anything. And so the Father is going to make us literal reflections, little replicas of Jesus Christ, who will radiate his glory and will praise and honor and glorify him forever and serve him. That is the Father's love gift to the Son. Paul goes on to write about this in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about when Christ comes back, our whole bodies will be transformed. We'll be like Christ. We'll have the same body as Christ. But the excitement comes really in the last book of the Bible, Revelation, chapter 13 and 17. They're both chapter 13, verse 8, and 17, verse 8. Both tell us the same fact, and it is this. It refers to believers, and in both verses it says, those whose names have been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. It says it twice. It says it twice. Do y'all remember Sesame Street and Vincent twice? And I love the way in the Bible, so many times it says it twice. That's for our sake. You know, let every matter be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so this is mind-boggling to me that our names were written in the book of life before God ever created us. And people can get all off on this, idea of predestination, that God has predestined some to heaven and some to hell. I don't believe that at all. Ephesians 1 tells us what we're predestined to. We're predestined to be adopted as his children. We're predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Whosoever will may come. Let him drink of the water of life freely. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him. So everyone has the offer, the free choice to choose him as Lord and Savior. But the mystery is that God, in his ultimate wisdom and knowledge, knows even beforehand who will accept him. But it's staggering that our names are written even before we were created in the book of life. Shazam. So, wrapping this up, back to Genesis 1. So, there was a plan before it was ever carried out. And only one component in the whole physical universe will last forever, and that is man. For only man, in the end, is what ultimately mattered to God. Only man is made in the image of God, not the heavenly beings, not the animals, no other thing in all of creation except mankind, male and female. It was only man that was the product of this divine counsel. So the core image of God can be summed up by one word, and I love this: personal. We are persons. We live on the basis of relationships. We understand fellowship. We understand love and communion and conversation and sharing thoughts and attitudes and ideas and experiences. And that is why we are relational with each other. It's why we're emotional. We're emotional because God is. We're relational because God is. That is why God created man. And that's why after he created him, he immediately said it's not good for man to be alone. Why? Because the image of God is personhood, and personhood can only function in relationship. The image of God is the capacity for personal relationships, and most importantly, for a personal relationship with God. So he's a God of relationship, and then he creates us in that image. So we are creatures of relationship, and that's the issue. The image of God is the capacity for relationships. God himself has never existed as a single, lonely, solitary, isolated individual. He has always existed in a family, in a relationship. From everlasting to everlasting, from eternity past to eternity future, there's always been Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and always will be. But that is the mystery of personhood. That is the origin of personality, that one God exists in three persons, in one being, one substance, whatever you want to call it, and that one being of God involves personhood. And when God made us in his image and in his likeness, he made us as persons, and he made us for relationships, primarily for relationship with him and then with each other. And the purpose of creating human beings on the earth was that we would become the bride of Christ, that we would become his beloved bride, and that Christ himself, through his death and resurrection death on the cross and resurrection from the dead, could redeem us, and one day we would live with him forever in paradise, a new heaven and a new earth. That was the plan before Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. Is that amazing or not? So keep that in mind. Now, as I want to read something else to you, let's look at just the conclusion. So he says, let us make man in our image and let them rule over the animals. So look at verse 27 of Genesis 1. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So I love this, that God could not express himself in one gender, so he had to create two. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the seas, birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Verse 31, God saw all that he had made, and that wasn't just good, it was very good. And there was evening and morning the sixth day. Chapter 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array, and by the seventh day God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. It didn't mean he was worn out, tired, and exhausted and needed to take a nap. It just meant he was finished. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is the account or the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And then as you move throughout the rest of chapter 2, it's like it expands and gives us more details of the rest of day 6 and how it was that God created Adam from the dust and breathed into him the breath of life and created a garden, a special garden, and planted him there and told him to work it and to till it. And then he said, gave him one command, from any tree in the garden. He put these two trees in the middle, the tree of life, that's the first one mentioned in verse 9, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the only command in this perfect environment was you can't eat from this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because there's a consequence. In the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Didn't mean that you're going to die on the spot. It means that you will ultimately experience death, which means God never intended us to die when he created us. So I want to pause there for a minute. I read Bible story books to my children growing up. When I have the chance, I get to read them for my grandkids. I've shared this, if some of you were here a couple years ago, I shared it at a Christmas tea. I fell in love. Someone gave me this several years ago. It's called the Jesus Storybook Bible by a woman named Sally Lloyd Jones, who's actually if you're wondering, she's no relation to Martin Lloyd Jones, the great Bible teacher, English Bible teacher. They just share the last name. But what I love about this Bible story book, unlike any other, and I've read a lot of them over the years, this one from the beginning starts with God's plan of redemption. And throughout every story that she tells, from the beginning to the end of the Bible, the stories that she includes, she weaves throughout every story this plan of salvation, unlike any other Bible story book I've read. So I want to read just a few little pages for you and how she condenses, I'm going to skip over some of it, but how she condenses down this beautiful truth that I just totally expanded on, but she crunches it down into this sweet truth to teach children. In the beginning was a perfect home. In the beginning there was nothing. Nothing to hear, nothing to feel, nothing to see, only emptiness and darkness and nothing. But God was there, and God had a wonderful plan. I'll take this emptiness, God said, and I'll fill it up. Out of the darkness, I'm going to make light. And out of nothing, I'm going to make everything. And like a mommy bird flutters her wings over her eggs to help her babies hatch, God hovered over the deep, silent darkness. He was making life happen. God spoke. That's all. And whatever he said, it happened. And so the next 6 days of creation began to unfold. God saw all that he had made, and he loved them, all of his creation, all of his creatures and animals. And they were lovely because he loved them. But God saved the best for last. From the beginning, God had a shining dream in his heart. He would make a people to share his forever happiness. They would be his children, and the world would be their perfect home. So God breathed life into Adam and Eve. When they opened their eyes, the first thing they ever saw was God's face. And when God saw them, he was like a new dad. You look like me. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever made. And God loved them with all his heart, and they were lovely because he loved them. And God looked at everything he made, perfect, he said, and it was. But all the stars and the mountains and oceans and galaxies and everything were nothing compared to how much God loved his children. He would move heaven and earth to be near them always. Whatever happened, whatever it cost, he would always love them. And so it was that wonderful love story that began. Until we get to chapter 2 and chapter 3, and things go terribly wrong. Adam and Eve lived happily ever in their beautiful home, and everything was perfect for a while, until the day when everything went wrong. God had a horrible enemy. His name was Satan. Satan had once been the most beautiful angel, but he didn't want to be just an angel. He wanted to be God. He grew proud and evil and full of hate, and God had to send him out of heaven. Satan was seething with anger and looked for a way to hurt God. He wanted to stop God's plan, stop this love story right here. So he disguised himself as a snake and waited in the garden. Now, God had given Adam and Eve only one rule: don't eat the fruit on that tree. Because if you do, you'll think you know everything and you'll stop trusting me, and then death and sadness and tears will come. You see, God knew if they ate the fruit, they would think they didn't need him, and they would try to make themselves happy without him. But God knew there was no such thing as happiness without him, and life without him wouldn't be life at all. And as soon as the snake saw his chance, he slithered silently up to Eve. Does God really love you? If he does, why won't he let you eat that nice, juicy, delicious fruit? Poor you. Perhaps God doesn't want you to be happy. And so he continues on the story about how Eve was so deceived by the serpent, how she took the fruit and ate it and gave it to Adam, and then things went terribly wrong. Suddenly it was no longer a dream, it was a nightmare. There was a chill in the air. Something strange was happening. They'd always been naked, but now they felt naked and wrong, and they didn't want anyone to see them, so they hid. Later that evening, as God was taking his walk, he called to them, "Children, where are you?" "Hiding," Adam said. "We were afraid of you. Did you eat the fruit that I told you not to eat?" "Eve made me do it," Adam said. "What have you done?" God said to Eve. "The serpent made me do it." And terrible pain came into God's heart. His children had just broken the one rule, hadn't broken the one rule, they'd also broken God's heart. They had broken their wonderful relationship with him, and now he knew everything else would break. God's creation would start to unravel and come undone and go wrong, and from now on, everything would die, even though it was all supposed to last forever. You see, sin had come into God's perfect world, and it would never leave. God's children would always be running after him and hiding in the dark. Their hearts would break now and never work properly again. God couldn't let his children live forever, not in such pain, not without him. There was only one way to protect them. "You'll have to leave the garden now," God told his children, his eyes filling with tears. "This is no longer your true home. It's not the place for you anymore." But before they left the garden, God made clothes for his children to cover them. He gently clothed them, and he sent them on a long, long journey out of the garden, out of their home. Well, in another story, it would have been the end, but not in this story. God loved his children too much to let the story end there. Even though he knew they would suffer, God had a plan, a magnificent dream. Even though he knew he would suffer, one day he would get his children back. One day he would make the world their perfect home again. And one day he would wipe every tear from their eyes. You see, no matter what, in spite of everything, God would love his children with a never stopping, never ending, like we sang about, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. And though they would forget him and run from him, deep in their hearts, God's children would miss him always and long for him. Lost children yearning for their home. Before they left the garden, God whispered a promise to Adam and Eve. "It will not always be so. I will come to rescue you. And when I do, I'm going to do battle against that snake. I'll get rid of the sin and the dark and the sadness you let in here. I'm coming back for you." And he would. One day, God himself would come. Isn't that a beautiful telling of the story of creation? And there we have it. So I want you to glance over at Genesis chapter 3, because the title of this first chapter, the first revelation, the first hint we have of this coming Savior, this coming Messiah, is right here in chapter 3, verse 15. This chapter is entitled Jesus the Serpent Crusher, because after God confronted Adam and then Eve, then he speaks to the serpent, and he's really speaking to Satan, of course, but he curses the serpent. "Cursed you are," verse 14, "above all the livestock and all the wild animals. You'll crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life." But then verse 15 is where this first promise comes from, this first hint, this first revelation of God's plan, of the gospel. "And I will put enmity," or war, or conflict, "between you," serpent, "and the woman, and between your offspring," meaning those who will follow after you, Satan, "and hers." And then there's this masculine pronoun, he, So coming from the seed of the woman, so first of all, there's a hidden promise there. She's not going to die because of her sin. She's not going to be instantly judged. She's going to bear children. There's going to be a seed, and from her descendants is going to come this one. He, a male, will crush your head, hence the serpent crusher, which is a fatal blow. And you will strike his heel. And she writes here, I think it's on page 15, kind of in the middle toward the bottom there, under hope within judgment. I love this. She says, God judged 3 beings, but in the judgment he gave the man and woman hope. He pronounced judgment, but he didn't curse the couple. He cursed the serpent and he cursed the ground, but he didn't curse man and woman. Instead, he promised a serpent crusher would come one day. The serpent would bruise his heel, but the woman's offspring, literally her seed, would deal a mortal blow. So, Genesis 3:15, you ought to circle it, highlight it in your Bible. In Christian circles and academic circles, they call this the proto-evangelium, because it is the first announcement of the gospel. Right here in the first book of the Bible, it's the first announcement that we have, that this is that first peak, if you will, of God's plan, his plan of redemption. And yet, it says, the serpent will cause the seed to suffer, but the suffering seed, Jesus Christ, will destroy the serpent. So even when you think of Christ when he hung on that cross, certainly the devil thought for sure, I've won. I have defeated Jesus. He's going to die, and he was going to be happy. But when you think Jesus had those nails in his hands and he had that spike through his feet, and crucifixion, you had to, a victim's heels would always be bruised because you were on a platform where you were continually trying to raise yourself up to get a breath, and so your heels would be bruised. So long before crucifixion was even invented, right in the beginning, there was that, specific prophecy that the serpent would strike or bruise the heel of Christ, the seed of the woman. And yet, even though the judgment on the woman was that through painful labor she'd bring forth children, within that judgment lived the hope of bearing life. She would bear children. She would give life. And then God's judgment on the man was that though through painful toil he would bring forth food. Within the judgment lived the hope of sustaining life. So even though they would eventually die, some 900 years later, they would eventually die, but humans would continue. And so we have this hope, this promise tucked right here in the opening story of creation, that God had a plan. And right here, God, in his wisdom and foreknowledge, knew that it would happen, but he still gave Adam and Eve in the perfect environment with everything they needed. And he gave them a choice, one command, and they chose to disobey. And we've been suffering the consequences ever since. And yet, God's plan at that point was just set into motion. So if you turn over to day 3, I'm just kind of moving along here. It says God's plan begins to unfold. And, as you move throughout the rest of the story, that, they begin to bear children. And so they begin to reproduce. And it goes on from there. I just want to mention what she talks about, this unfolding plan of God, because what she will deal with throughout the rest of our study is basically eras or time periods. And if you look at page 17, it says the reveal continues. And so the way they've broken it down is into 9 important eras. There will be 6 eras in the Old Testament and then 2 in the New. And then they're listed here. So we're beginning right in the beginning in Eve's day. And then we'll move next week into the time of Abraham's day after the flood. From there, after the children of Israel, they're in Egypt, they'll come out of Egypt. So then we're dealing with Moses' day. And then you have the kingdom is established, and there's a king now, and there was Saul and King David, and the promise will go through King David. So we'll deal with that section, David's day, as we move through all these prophecies. And then there's the time of the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then there's all the minor prophets as well. And then after the exile, when they came back and the temple was rebuilt, that would be the 6th period of time in the Old Testament, which she calls the Second Temple's Day. Or you can think of it as the post-exile, after they were out of captivity. And then she only mentions one for the New Testament. She says Jesus' Day. We'll deal with that, and we'll go back and forth as we see these prophecies unfold. And I'm sure the second one is the future, the last days leading into our future home in heaven. So then so that's how you'll see it laid out. This week we're in Eve's day, and next week we'll move right into the next era, which would be during the days of Abraham and the promises that God gave to Abraham and his descendants. So next on day 4, it's interesting because it's a practical lesson for us. She compares Eve's temptation with Jesus being tempted by the devil in the wilderness. And it's easy to note when Satan came disguised as that serpent, when he came to Eve, it's just like John or James wrote about, all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those were the 3 things that Satan tempted Eve with, are the very same things he tempted Jesus with. So she notes here in Matthew 4, so in comparing the two, she tested Eve's obedience, whether Adam and Eve would obey what God had said, you shall not eat. And he just turned it right around. Did God really say you can't eat? So he took a positive and turned it into a negative. But Satan also tempted Jesus. So you think of the 3 temptations of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, and they're listed there at the bottom of 19. The first test that Jesus had, so remember, after he was baptized, he went out into the desert where he fasted for 40 days, didn't eat, didn't drink, and the Bible tells us at the end of that period he was hungry and weak and tired. And of course, that's always when the enemy attacks. So, I often think, Adam was probably not standing right next to Eve when Satan came along. He was probably off somewhere else, and that's why he came up on her when she was maybe alone and vulnerable, and that's what he does to us all the time. So in the first instance, Satan came to Jesus and said, if you're hungry, command, and I know that if you're the Son of God, command that these stones are turned to bread. He knew he was the Son of God. He knew he had the power to do it, and he was tempting him to do it, to immediately satisfy his hunger. And remember, Eve saw that the fruit was pleasing to the eye and good for food, and she desired it. The only difference is that she ate and Jesus resisted. And he didn't give himself the one advantage, that divine advantage he could have used but didn't, against a temptation that no other human had. Like no other human would have the power to turn stones to bread. Jesus could have done that with a word, but he didn't. He relied on the Father's words, and in each case, what does he come back with? It is written. It is written. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And then in the second test, Satan knows Scripture, and he quotes the Scripture to him. He took him up to the highest point of the temple. If you're the Son of God, cast yourself down from here because it's written. He'll send his angels to bear you up so you won't, lest you strike yourself against a stone. So Satan knew the Scripture, and he was using it against him. And yet Jesus came back with Scripture. It is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And Jesus recognized that putting one's life in danger to try to force God to prove his care was testing God. And though Satan tried to plant doubt in God's good care, just as he had tried to plant doubt in the mind of Eve, Jesus trusted the Father completely and refused to test him. And then the third test, where he takes him up to a great mountaintop and shows him all the kingdoms of the world, All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. And then that's when Jesus was basically, get the hints, scat, get out of here, Satan. It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And so in each case you can see the difference in how Jesus responded, which is the lesson to us. When we're weak, when we're vulnerable, when we're being tempted by the enemy, this is why we got to know the scripture, we got to know the word of God, we got to hide it in our heart, because that's the way we resist. James 4, resist the devil and he will flee from you. So that's the great takeaway. Again, we see how Eve was so easily deceived, and we can resist being tempted in the same way if we practice exactly what Jesus did. Know the word and use the word, even verbally, against the attacks of the enemy. Also want to just mention this on page 21, because we'll see this as we move through these different prophecies. She says there's 3 ways to discover Jesus in the Old Testament. And the 3 key ways you see this being unfolded is 1, through promises, which is what Genesis 3:15, a promise that this descendant, this seed, this coming one is going to crush your head. The next are prophecies. Sometimes God reveals things to people that they can't see or understand through natural means. Most prophecies usually call people to repent, as she says, in order to avoid judgment. But other prophecies predict a significant future event. So there's a lot of predictive prophecies, or things that are going to happen in the future. And we'll find out a lot of very specific details about this coming one, this one who will crush the serpent's head. You'll see it's a gradual unfolding. As we move through the Old Testament, you see God reveals over time more detail and more specific details, which are all fulfilled in the life of Christ. And as we move through each one of these lessons, you'll see each time that she'll connect the dots for us to see the actual fulfillment in Christ. And then a portent, which is something that foreshadows something in the future. Some Old Testament people, institutions, or events either foreshadow Jesus or something significant in Jesus' life. Sometimes they're described as patterns or copies or shadows or types. But the fulfillment is always greater than the type. So, for instance, there is this type of salvation, the atonement that we receive through the shed blood of Christ. If you look at the end of chapter 3 of Genesis, if you glance over where after verse 21, the Lord made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothe them. So in order for God to make garments of skin, of course he spoke the world into existence, but to get garments of skin from an animal means the animal's going to have to die to get the skin off of it. And my best guess that it's probably a sheep. I don't know if lambs were born yet, but that's soft because, throughout the later, when the whole sacrificial system would be set in order, this is the grace of God. He didn't allow them to die. He let an animal die in their place. And that was a type or a picture or a portent, a foreshadowing of what was going to come in the future. Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. And their sin was costly, and it cost the life of another. God allowed an animal to take their place. Blood had to be shed, not their blood, but that the shedding of that blood clothed them. It covered their sin. It covered their shame. And so that was a whole type, a picture, as it were, of what was coming. This coming Messiah, this one who is going to rescue us and solve this problem of sin, ultimately through his own death. So then, finally, I'm just going to look briefly at this on day 5, the serpent's end. So she just kind of wants to fast forward to show that this was the prediction that one day, from the very beginning, when he showed up on the scene, that old serpent, the devil, that he has an ultimate end, a very deliberate ultimate end. Now, he's been on a long leash for a long time, and even throughout the last days, he's going to, it's as if God gives him even more reign on the earth until finally he is thrown into the lake of fire into hell, and chained there for 1,000 years before he is then released and then finally defeated. So that's what I want to look at, the serpent's end in our last few minutes. Let's discover Satan's final end. So I just want to mention this one first because it's a great verse. She talks about how the book of Hebrews is written to a Jewish audience who were suffering terrible persecution in the days of the early church. And Hebrews is a wonderful book because it goes through and shows how Jesus is the fulfillment of this Old Testament prophecies. He's greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than the law. You know, he was the one sacrifice for sin for all times. But there's a beautiful verse in chapter 2. I wrote it out, but it's Hebrews. It's on page 22. Hebrews 2, verse 14 and 15 say this, speaking about Jesus becoming human like us, sharing in our suffering, our own flesh and blood. It says that he shared in our humanity so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, and then it tells us who him is, that is the devil, and has freed those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. So the initial defeat was at the cross. When Christ rose from the dead, he defeated death. He conquered death. Death no longer rules and reigns, but ultimately there's coming a day when there's no more death. And Satan has a final doom. So this is in Revelation. So she mentions a couple verses here, Revelations, page 23. You'll see where the heading says, God with us forever. Revelation 1:18, Jesus says, I died, and behold, I'm alive forevermore, and I have the keys to death. And then in chapter 2, Jesus promises, to him who overcomes, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So it's interesting, Jesus never told Adam and Eve that they couldn't eat from the tree of life, but he banished them from the garden when they sinned, because in that sinful state, he didn't want them to eat from the tree of life and continue on in that sinful state forever. So he drove them away from that tree, barred them from it. But we read clearly in the book of Revelation, that tree will be there again. That tree will be restored, and we'll have the right to eat from it. But the final doom, let's just look there, because this is where we end. The ultimate fulfillment of that promise in Genesis 3, that Jesus will crush the head of Satan. Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20, just a couple verses here. I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, or hell, and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nation anymore until the 1,000 years were ended, and after that he'll be set free for a short time. So then in verse 7, it simply says, when the 1,000 years were ended, Satan will be released from his prison, so he will be bound for 1,000 years. He'll be released to go out and deceive the nations. Verse 9, they'll march across the breadth of the earth and surround the camp of God's people, the city he loves, which will be Jerusalem. But fire comes down from heaven and devours them, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur where the beast and the false prophet had been, and they will be tormented day and night forever, and that will be his final home. That's when he will be defeated, destroyed, never again to cause harm, death, sin, evil, wickedness. He will be banished forever and ever. So, first prophecy we're looking at, the first prophecy we get of the coming Messiah right in the beginning in the story of creation. The first promise, anybody ever ask you, where's the first hint of the gospel in the Bible? Genesis 3:15. And so at the end, she reminds us, we have God with us today, we'll have God with us forever, but we have the constant dwelling of in the Holy Spirit. The person of Jesus lives in us in the person of the Holy Spirit. And she talks about these praise psalms, the Hallel psalms in Psalm 113 to 18. So I wanted us to end our time together doing what she suggests here, and I just want us to read it together. Even if we don't have all the same translation, that's okay. We're still going to read it together. So turn in your Bible to Psalm 113, and this is how we will close our evening out in thanks and praise to God for being the ultimate promise keeper. Psalm 113. These are called the Hallel Psalms because they all begin and they all talk about praising God, which is Hallel is praise in Hebrew. So let us read verse 1 through 6, and then we're going to conclude with praise the Lord, which is the last phrase. Okay? Here we go. Are you ready? All together. Praise the Lord. Praise, O servants of the Lord. Praise the name of the Lord. Let the name of the Lord be praised both now and forevermore. From the rising of the sun to the place where it sets, the name of the Lord is to be praised. The Lord is exalted over all the nations, his glory above the heavens. Who is like the Lord our God, the one who sits enthroned on high, who stoops down to look on the heavens and the earth? Praise the Lord.